Afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us here today. I want to thank Mo Wright, Aaron Sink, and all of the members of the Civilian Review Board Work Group, and obviously our incredible partner and chief advocate for change and reform, Council President Hardin. I want to thank you all. Together, we've endured what has been an incredibly challenging year. We're still in the grasp of a global pandemic, which has taken the lives of hundreds of thousands of our neighbors across the country. At the same time, our nation has had to grieve the unnecessary and tragic loss of life at the hands of law enforcement. The deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd spurred calls for social justice, racial equity, and police accountability. And now, the death of Casey Goodson Jr. has strengthened our resolve to deliver that change right here in Columbus. Our work did not start this year, but when I launched my campaign for mayor more than 6 years ago, I ran on a commitment to implementing body-worn cameras across the Division of Police, and we delivered. They have proved to be an invaluable tool to protect the community and the police. I also promised to conduct independent reviews of police policies, procedures, and training. We seated the Columbus Community Safety Advisory Commission in 2018 and received their recommendations earlier this year. We hired Matrix Consulting to look into police operations, and they came back with findings of racial discrimination, both in how residents of color are treated by police and how minority police officers are treated within the ranks. Before the pandemic and before the protests of this past summer, we were implementing these recommendations, changing policies, and adapting strategies to make sure all residents feel safe. But since the protests of this past summer, we have joined together as a community to redouble our efforts to bring about change, and we've made meaningful and lasting reforms. In the last 6 months, we reviewed and ultimately changed policy use of force in response to nonviolent protests, including the use of tear gas and pepper spray to disperse crowds. We engaged an independent law firm to investigate administrative charges into use of force stemming from protests. We hired a former FBI agent to investigate potential criminal charges. We entered into an agreement with BCI, the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, to handle police-involved shootings by the Columbus Division of Police that resulted in death in custody or fatality. We launched an interactive web-based dashboard to track the progress of implementing 200+ recommendations from the Matrix Review and Community Safety Advisory Commission. One of the recommendations of the Safety Advisory Commission was to establish an independent civilian review board. We set up a work group to review best practices of civilian oversight in other cities and establish a framework for civilian review board here in Columbus. At the same time, we presented an amendment to the city charter to establish and fully fund a civilian review board. Columbus City Council approved the amendment and it was put on the November ballot. And as you all know, the community spoke loudly and clearly for their support of a charter amendment establishing a civilian review board within the role of an inspector general with subpoena power. Today, I received the final report from the Civilian Review Board Working Group, and I'm happy to release their recommendations, which include a 9-member Civilian Review Board with staggered 3-year terms. Members will be appointed by me in consultation with Columbus City Council. The board will be diverse in race, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and a majority of its members must live in the city of Columbus. The board will receive training and support in important subject matters like de-escalation, implicit bias, constitutional law, and other valuable topics at the beginning of their terms and throughout their years of service. The minimum qualifications for the new Inspector General and staffing for this new department will be set by the board once it's seated. And per the work group's recommendation, we will do all that. We can ensure the Civilian Review Board has broad investigative powers, including subpoena powers, and that they will be empowered to conduct independent investigations. I'm deeply grateful to the work of the Civilian Review Board work group. They worked deliberately and diligently to reach consensus, set aside differences, and produce recommendations that will guide our efforts to deliver the civilian oversight that our community is demanding. In a few minutes, I'll talk about our next steps. But first, I'd like to give Council President Shannon Hardin, who's been my incredible partner in all of this reform work as part of the larger equity agenda, a chance to share a few words and a couple of folks who were involved with the work group to weigh in as well. President Hardin?
Thank you, Mayor. You're right, this has been a challenging year for everyone. Yet the work has been done. So I too want to join you in thanking the Civilian Review Working Group for helping to put together the recommendations for council and the mayor to push forward. This year, the centuries of systemic racism plaguing our country became clear to many. We are struggling with our own demons here in Columbus as we work to address the barriers that have held down many Black and brown families for far too long. From the disproportionate COVID impacts to police shootings, Black and brown families have been under unique pressure this year. The author James Baldwin once said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Our city is facing notable challenges when it comes to trust between police and community. But in response to the killing of George Floyd, we passed the largest package of police reform in generations. We rewrote our purchasing code to demilitarize our police force. We limited the use of no-knock warrants, the tactic that led to Breonna Taylor's death. We instituted background check for hate group affiliations amongst our police, and we put issue 2 before the voters to create an independent civilian review board and an office of the Inspector General. As the mayor said, on November 3rd, voters registered their resounding support for issue 2, with more than 70% of our voters casting their vote in favor of accountability and reform. The mayor pulled together the Civilian Review Working Group to help analyze how this new body and this new office of the Inspector General would function. We've taken bold steps, but this is still just the beginning. Right now, Columbus City Council is in the middle of our budget process where we will continue to push reform and reimagining public safety. We held a hearing last week on the mayor's proposed 2021 budget, which includes $1 million for the Civilian Review Board and the Office of the Inspector General. With the Civilian Review Working Group's recommendations in hand now, Council will hold additional hearings at the start of the new year. Rebuilding trust and improving accountability in the Division of Police is a critical component to reimagining safety here in Columbus. Council appreciates the Civilian Review Working Group for providing recommendations on the important structural questions of how this review board should operate. We will engage in a deliberative process to review these recommendations and pass the appropriate legislation that will allow us to stand up that Civilian Review Board in 2021. Council will also need to allocate the dollars necessary to ensure the first year of the Civilian Review Board and the Office of the Inspector General are a success. We will continue to have more hearings in January to dive deeper into the 3 pillars of reimagining public safety. They are establishing an alternative crisis response model, investing in violence prevention, and investing in a more accountable division of police to build trust within the community. Recognizing that reform is a marathon and not a sprint, we will continue to push forward with these practical measures to rebuild trust and improve safety in our city. At this point, I'd like to introduce Mo Wright, President and CEO of RAMA, to discuss the working group's process. Mo?
Thank you, Councilman Harden, and certainly to our mayor for his leadership around this issue. For us at RAMA, this was important work that we were so excited to be engaged in. The work of the Civilian Review Board actually preceded the passage of the Charter Amendment. For many months, since August of this year, members of this work group have been engaged in deliberative conversations about what does the work group need to look like? What kinds of qualifications need to be a part of sitting on the CRB? And then what kinds of broad investigative and other roles might this group need to play in order to make sure there's accountability in our policing that our residents are demanding? The group was diverse and representative across our community. We've met 7 times between the period of August and December, and we bring forward today the recommendations of this group. But it was just not good thinking of a group of committed residents. We coupled that with policy experts from around the nation, research into what other civilian review boards were doing in other cities, and we talked to practitioners, those who were doing the work in other cities, about lessons learned, about potential pitfalls, about how to ensure that there's really accountability in the work that we wanted to bring forward. The group has been extremely thoughtful in this process with some spirited debate and a lot of diverse perspectives, and we have codified the recommendations that are coming forward from the group today. During the course of those deliberations, many of the folks expressed concerns about the accountability measures, and so we tried to bring forth recommendations that have teeth, that are bold, that are thoughtful, and that are thorough. As I close, these recommendations matter. They matter to our neighbors, they matter to the citizens of Columbus, and they certainly matter to residents who look like me. And so I, on behalf of my team at RAMA, have been excited to be a part of this work and look forward to the heavy lifting of bringing these recommendations to fruition in our city. That said, I wanted to introduce Erin Sink, who was a member of the Civilian Review Board work group, for her comments as well.
Together. I first want to recognize the dedication of the working group. As has been mentioned, it is a very diverse group of incredibly thoughtful people representing a wide range of views and perspectives, all of whom volunteered their time and their talent to develop a model for a civilian review board that will work for us here in Columbus. And it has been a great honor to serve with all of you. It's also important to take a moment to remember why we embarked on this journey of reform, including creating a civilian review board. Because too many families in our community have grieved the loss of their loved ones without the full realization of justice. Because we understand that bias exists across our community, including within the Division of Police, and that we know we must work to root it out. And because we see that the trust that has been fundamentally shaken between the community and our law enforcement officers, but also because we can envision a Columbus that is safer and fairer for every community member. You know, the need to reform, to make change and restore that trust could not be more urgent, and it is very clearly our pathway forward. We all know that we entrust our police officers with an incredible amount of power and authority to detain, to search, to restrain, and even sometimes to take a life. And so there must be accountability when that power and trust are misused. And so a strong, fair, and independent civilian review board will bring a new lens of transparency and accountability that will protect both the public and our officers. The most important thing to do now that we have recommendations coming forward is to act. We have taken the time to study and review, to debate what a civilian review board that works for Columbus should look like. Over the course of the last year, the creation of a civilian review board has gone from a recommendation of the Safety Commission to a demand of protesters in our streets to a clear mandate of voters at the ballot box. And so we know there is no time to waste. We must implement and seat the civilian review board as quickly as possible so that it can begin this very critical work of restoring openness and trust between our law enforcement officers and the public they serve. It has been a long journey to get to this point, And we know that the road ahead is also long. But I firmly believe that by working together, taking on these next challenges, this heavy lifting to set up this board and get it functioning, we will enact a board that is an important step forward to achieving this fairer Columbus that I know all of us here today seek. So thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you so much, Aaron and Mo and President Hardin. I want to thank you again, Aaron, for serving both on the Columbus Community Safety Advisory Commission and the Civilian Review Board Working Group. We thought it was important to have folks, a representation of folks that were part of that initial advisory group to also serve on that working group. And so I know you and a few others did double duty, an incredible amount of time and energy and sharing of your gifts with your city. And I want to thank you, Aaron, and to Mo and his incredible team that facilitated a very dynamic, inclusive, engaging process where lots of different viewpoints were heard. And the whole reason President Hardin and I and his colleagues wanted a diverse group of people to serve on this working group is to have that debate, have that discussion, have that dialogue, and ultimately come up with recommendations on best practices from around the country and that would work best here in Columbus. So thank you to Mo and your team. Starting today, we are accepting applications for those who wish to serve on the Civilian Review Board. The application is online at the Civilian Review Board Workgroup webpage, and the deadline to submit is January 15th, 2021. We hope to move swiftly to appoint the board. Once the board is seated, we will begin a search for an inspector general. At the same time, we will continue negotiations with the FOP to work on some of the recommendations that need to be addressed in the collective bargaining agreement, including broad independent investigative powers, the ability to issue subpoenas with City Council and the City Attorney's Office approval. Change is difficult, but it is necessary. President John F. Kennedy said, "Change is the law of life, and those who look only to the past or present are certain to miss the future." We will shape the future here in Columbus around police reform, accountability, transparency. We can support our officers and demand change and reform at the same time. And that's exactly what we intend to do. I'm confident that our Civilian Review Board will meet the needs of the community and help us restore trust in law enforcement, reimagine how we police our community, and ensure every resident in every neighborhood is safe. With that, we'll open the floor to questions. We'll use the raise hand function. You should all have received instructions, but I'll go over them quickly. You should see a hand icon in the bottom right corner of your screen. Click on the hand and you'll see a hand next to your name in the attendee list. That's how we know you've raised your hand. We'll unmute you to ask your question. Please state your name and media outlet before you ask your question. And after your question's been addressed, please click the hand next to your name to turn off the function. If you have additional questions or a follow-up to your initial question, please click it again. So with that, we will take your questions. And it looks like first question is going to come from Tom Fosco. Good afternoon, Tom.
Hey, Mayor. Thanks for taking my question. So just to be sure, this Civilian Review Board, this has been addressed, would not be applicable in the Casey Goodson situation, correct?
That is correct. The city charter amendment that was passed, as the council president mentioned, overwhelmingly only involves police misconduct, investigations into police misconduct involving the Columbus Division of Police. Any other law enforcement agency or political subdivision that would want this Civilian Review Board to have that oversight would have to ask for it. So in this case of Mr. Goodson's death, that would have to be a request that would come from the County Sheriff's Department and we'd have to enter into some type of MOU. My guess is that would also require some changes to their collective bargaining agreement as well. I think our next question, unless you have a follow-up, Tom, is from Eric Halperin.
Hey, Mayor, thanks for doing this afternoon. I know you said the applications open up today to apply for the Civilian Review Board and that you'll be appointing members. How is that process going to work? Who's going to be going over these applications to make the decision along with you on who serves on the board?
Well, obviously, we'll be looking at a variety of things, and if you take a look at the recommendations put out by the Civilian Review Board Working Group, there are many things that Erin and her colleagues want us to take into consideration, and wanted to make sure that we didn't exclude certain members of the community for any particular reason either. And so it's very important to make sure that the overwhelming majority of these folks live in the city of Columbus. And, you know, we're looking for a very diverse group of people with diverse skill sets and a commitment to roll up their sleeves. There's going to be a significant amount of work involved with serving on the Civilian Review Board. But ultimately, Eric, I'll be working with city council members as we review applications, and I'll make recommendations, and ultimately it will require council action as well. I think our next question is from Ray Miller.
Yeah, Mayor, I want to commend you on the work that's being done and also the consulting team. On the first question that was asked about the Casey Goodson, and I understood the response, but is there anything in that situation that informs the work that you'll be doing with the Civilian Review Board?
I don't know if we all know enough about what happened and where that investigation will ultimately lead to see how that may impact how this board and the Inspector General go about doing their work. You know, obviously, anything we can learn from these tragic situations that have taken place either in this community or in communities around the country, we want to learn from them. I guess I would defer to Erin or Mo if there was. I know you all just recently wrapped up your work and took an extra session or two to go through things with any more detail. I'm not sure if there were any details around the Goodson shooting or death that would have been taken into account with respect to recommendations. Erin or Mo, any insight into that?
So one thing I would say is we completed our final meeting prior to this tragic incident. And so I think just speaking for myself, there are things that I have learned that have come to light from this. I think we will continue to learn as those investigations carry forward. And although they are not representing our recommendations that we made because we completed our work prior, I would certainly encourage your office, City Council, and all the future board members to do those kinds of reviews, look at what is happening, to take in those learnings, and then respond accordingly.
I think the only thing I would add, and if the council president wants to share any thoughts, the only thing I would add, Ray, is that we entered into an MOU with BCI earlier this summer that any police-involved shooting that ended in a fatality or death in custody would automatically bring in BCI from the beginning to complete that investigation. That didn't necessarily include other law enforcement agencies that had a police-involved shooting that ended in a fatality or death in custody within our jurisdiction. But what I've made clear to the chief is that from now on, regardless of the law enforcement agency, if there's a police-involved shooting that ends in a fatality or death in custody within the city of Columbus, whether it's the Columbus Division of Police or another law enforcement agency, BCI will handle that investigation from the outset. And it's not because I don't have confidence in the ability of the Division of Police to conduct the investigation. I think it's absolutely critically important right now that we add an additional level of independence of investigation and to have BCI conduct that for all police involved shootings that end in fatality or death in custody that happen within the city of limits, whether they're Division of Police, law enforcement professionals, or from another law enforcement agency. President Hardin, any additional comments?
I think you hit that. The last point is where I would focus on is when you have a case like Casey Goodson and where justice has to be served, the one thing that we have to do after an unfortunate, terrible incident like that is make sure that there is transparency and independence in the investigation. And so I think the broader point of having a civilian review board, having that inspector general, and then having the public themselves say that they wanted this is the critical point. And I think that that's the lesson that I'm taking away from the last several weeks here in our city.
I think our next question is from Lacey Crisp. Good afternoon, Lacey.
Hi, Mayor. Thanks for taking my question. I was wondering how you're going to ensure that this is an independent body if you and council are selecting all of the members.
Well, I think, that's critically important that this group be independent and that they be committed to represent the diversity of this community. Ultimately, the council president and I will be held accountable by the voters of this city as to whether or not this civilian review board meets their expectations and what they voted on and voted for in an overwhelming fashion this fall. It's very important to us to make sure that all perspectives are included and reflected in this civilian review board. And I think the working group made that very clear in their recommendations. And I believe that Council President, his colleagues, and myself are going to take that to heart and make sure that we are following the lead of the voters and this working group. President Hardin?
No, I would just add that because these terms are staggered and because they're appointments, there will be full independence from us. We got to also remember that the Inspector General is not chosen by us, but selected by the working group. And so I think that the review board, I think the working group in particular did good work in that space to try to give us recommendations that would create that greater independence and their ability to have that oversight and lead those investigations without our interference.
Lacey, did you have a follow-up question or another question?
I do. Thank you, Mayor. I was wondering, you had explained that they will have to go through some sort of training. Can you go into a little bit more detail about that training? Will they be forced to do like ride-alongs? I know Reynoldsburg just passed the Civilian Review Board, and that was part of that training. I was also wondering, I believe in the budget, it's set aside about $1 million for the Civilian Review Board. Is that still an accurate cost for this board? And will these be part-time or full-time positions?
Well, I'll attempt to answer some of the questions and obviously want to give Aaron, who was a member of the working group and helped to shape these recommendations, speak to things as well as far as training and things that the working group would like to see take place. I know the council president and I are very interested in the Civilian Review Board members to have the training and the background and continuing education about issues involving, as I mentioned, everything from constitutional law to de-escalation, dealing with implicit bias and other things. I think are going to be very important training and background for folks who serve on the Civilian Review Board. We do feel very comfortable with the proposed budget that I introduced to council. Obviously, council's conducting hearings and ultimately will vote to approve a budget early in 2021. We feel confident that what we propose will help to fund the operations of the board and the inspector general and her or his a team of professional investigators. Again, remember, the inspector general and his or her team will be conducting the investigations, and then the civilian review board will be making recommendations on discipline to the chief of police. And so, but we feel comfortable and confident with where we're at in this process. Aaron, anything else from the work group's perspective on training or background that you think are important?
So I think we all thought that training was very, very important for these members in order to be able to effectively carry out their, their charge. There is a lot of there's a lot of technicality. There's a lot of highly technical information that needs to be understood about not just constitutional law, but department policy, and then how those policies actually work out on the street if you're really looking at policing and police action. And so I think it's very important that robust training is in place to give those board members the best opportunity for successfully carrying out their charge in a fair and independent manner. I personally would say that I think ride-alongs can be a very powerful tool in that. I know I went on a ride-along, a whole 8-hour shift at the beginning of the Safety Commission process, and that was very helpful to really understand what the job is like, what you see our officers going through every day, and to understand how the police officers in the community really interact with one another. So while we didn't prescribe specific training, we gave some examples of things that we definitely think should be considered. And I know myself, and I'm sure many others would be happy to make ourselves available as those conversations continue about what that.
Yeah, I think specifically, Aaron, thank you for that. Recommendation 8, Lacey, it says the board members should receive training in police tactics, constitutional law, de-escalation, implicit bias, and other valuable topics at the beginning of their terms and throughout their years of service. So that was recommendation 8 of this report. I think you also asked a question about full-time, part-time. I think we believe that this will be none of the board members, it will not be a paid position, and that we anticipate the inspector general and her or his team of investigators will be full-time employees, but that members of the civilian review board will not be. Tom, do you have another question?
I do, and I couldn't unmute myself fast enough to ask it earlier. So can you ensure to the public that this will be fair and transparent? I think a lot of people will see that the way this was handled, I'm talking about the Casey Goodson investigation, the way this was handled at the beginning with the investigation bounced around between a couple of agencies, with the agencies distancing themselves from the deputy, et cetera. I mean, is this really instilling a lot of confidence in the community and the family of Casey Goodson that this investigation will be thorough, fair, and transparent? And has anyone from the city met with his family?
I won't speak to President Harden. I am meeting with Casey Goodson's mother this week, and we have been in touch with the family leading up to that meeting. I can say this, I have complete confidence that this investigation will be complete, thorough, and accurate, and that we will pursue truth and justice wherever it takes us. But what was critically important for me is to have an independent set of eyes, some additional independent review and investigation. And that's why I was so happy that U.S. Attorney Dave DeVillers agreed to have the Civil Rights Division as part of the DOJ come in to do a concurrent investigation alongside CPD into any potential civil rights violations that Mr. Goodson might have faced. So I feel comfortable and confident that this investigation will be complete and thorough and accurate. But I also think that it's made very clear to us that anytime a situation like this might occur in the future, that BCI is automatically called in to conduct the investigation from the beginning. And again, it's not because the Division of Police can't complete, that we don't have confidence they can complete an investigation. It's for the public's reassurance that a certain amount of independence is going to be, seen in the way the investigation is completed and done. It's to reassure the public that they can have confidence in that. And that's why I'm so glad that we have the DOJ, U.S. Attorney DeVillers doing a concurrent investigation while CPD conducts their investigation into this at the same time. President Hardin?
I would just add that yes, I've been talked to Ms. Payne and shared my condolences for her loss.
I also believe that the chief and the U.S. attorney have met with Mrs. Payne as well. I believe that might have even been last week. Our next question is from Lacey Crisp.
Mayor, I was wondering if you can kind of explain for those people who aren't aware what kind of cases the Civilian Review Board is going to be looking into, what kind of complaints that they'll take their time to look into, because obviously they don't have the time or the capacity to look into everything.
Well, obviously, use of force will be something that I think will be a top priority. Other types of police misconduct. As you know, Lacey, there are some folks who have a high level of confidence in reporting police misconduct and issues to the Internal Affairs Bureau. But there's an awful lot of people in our community, our neighbors, that have zero confidence that the police can investigate themselves. And so having this truly independent, civilian review board that's taking complaints of police misconduct, having an independent inspector general and a team of professional investigators doing those investigations, and then ultimately that civilian review board making recommendations to the chief on discipline is going to be very important for us to continue to reassure the public and restore the public's trust in law enforcement. So all different types of police misconduct, but certainly I imagine that use of force and other things will probably be what is shared most frequently based on, and I don't know if Aaron and Mo want to speak to this, the types of things that got shared with civilian review boards around the country, but my guess is that'll be one of the top things referred to them.
I do think those are common to be the top things. I'll also note that the Safety Advisory Commission recommended independent investigations, in particular for officer-involved shootings, in-custody deaths, excessive use of force, and discrimination. And I think that sentiment carried through with the working group that investigations into those types of complaints were critical, of the highest priority, and at a minimum, the board should be investigating those types of cases.
Yeah, and just to add to that, in addition, I think one of the parameters that in the recommendation speaks to the role that the board would play in actually reviewing patterns of behavior. So in addition to individual cases, one of the things the CRB would be looking into is, are we seeing consistently that our officers or the division as a whole are acting with certain practices or procedures, and how do we ensure that those are fair, and perhaps make recommendations for changes where necessary to the chief and to the public safety director. So there is a case-by-case investigative function, but there is also this broader policy recommendation piece as well that is a part of the recommendation.
Lacey, do you have another question or a follow-up?
I do. Thank you, Mayor. I was wondering, so right now, any decision made by the CRB, their recommendations, how are negotiations going with the FOP to give the CRB the teeth, so to speak?
Well, I feel very optimistic about negotiations with the FOP. I think ultimately what we all need to do is listen to the community. And the community spoke very loudly and clearly about their expectations around reform. And we are going to the table in good faith, working with the FOP, but reform and the Civilian Review Board with subpoena power and an inspector general are our top priorities as we enter into negotiations. But I believe that all of us want the same thing, a safer community. We want our officers to be safer, but we also are demanding reform and justice. And I believe we can do those things together, focusing on what the people are demanding and the critical importance. Law enforcement has no power unless it's granted to them by the community. We give incredible power to law enforcement. As Aaron mentioned, nobody else on this call has the power to stop somebody, to detain them, to question them, to take their freedom, and ultimately, if necessary, their life. So there is an exceptionally high level of accountability that goes along with an incredibly awesome power. And that is where we need to come together to make sure that we support our officers and demand they change and reform at the same time. And I have a great deal of confidence we can do that. But the community is demanding action, and that's what we need to see happen. Lacey, did you have another question? Any other questions from the press?
I do. One last question. Thank you, Mayor, for giving me the time to ask you these questions. Just one kind of clarification on who is going to have the final say on who goes onto the board, if there's any kind of disagreement between yourself and council.
I think ultimately those appointments will take place. I think council, is that right, Council President Harden? Will you all vote on these appointments?
Yes, we see these much like we see the Health Commission and others, where there are recommendations made, council deliberates and then votes on those recommendations to the board.
So obviously it will force the administration and council to work together to make sure that we seat a board that reflects the priorities, recommendations, skill sets that Erin and her colleagues have made recommendations to us on, and that are consistent with the charter amendment that was approved by the voters earlier this year. Any other questions from the press? Lacey, do you have another question, or have you just not had a chance to put your hand down?
I'm sorry, Mayor. I was just wondering, will all of the applicants, will that be made public? Will the discussions between yourself and council, will those be a matter of a public format?
Well, I know that the applications will all be public records, and you know, we haven't contemplated what type of process will take place. Obviously, the action by council will be in a public meeting, and in conversation about the folks that are being considered and ultimately appointed will be part of a public setting and an open meeting. President Harden, any additional comments on that?
We will deliberate, and we will have hearings on a broad fashion about the Civilian Review Board over the next several months. And so I think that we all are working for transparency. This is the whole reason we created this. The whole reason we went to the voters was for greater transparency and accountability, and that's what this council will be committed to. And I'm sure the mayor is a good partner on that as well.
Thank you, President Harden. If there aren't any other additional questions, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Erin and her colleagues again for all of their work, to Mo and his team for helping to facilitate and guide a very great process in a very short period of time. I want to thank you for that. To President Harden and his colleagues, I want to thank them for their partnership. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to Robin Davis in the mayor's office or to Lee Cole at the council office, and we will get you all the information that we can. Have a good rest of the day. Thanks, everybody.